On February 4th, 2021, Sandra Birchmore's co-workers call the police. The 23-year-old Sandra has not shown up for work that day. This is quite unusual for the otherwise very reliable woman. The police offer to conduct a welfare check. A patrol car drives to Sandra's address and rings the doorbell to see if everything is okay. However, no one answers. The police officers decide to gain access to the apartment. They are immediately struck by an unpleasant odor. Sandra Birchmore is lying dead in her apartment. She appears to have been there for between 48 and 72 hours. At first, everything looks like suicide to the police. The deceased is found sitting on the floor. A piece of rope is tied around her neck, which is connected to the doorknob of the wardrobe. Accordingly, the initial finding is suicide by hanging. Sandra's relatives are shocked. The young woman certainly did not have an easy life. But in the last few days and weeks, there had been absolutely no signs that Sandra was not doing well. On the contrary, the 23-year-old seemed happier than ever. However, after the initial shock, when her relatives clear out Sandra's apartment, they come across some strange objects. These pieces belong to a puzzle that is slowly coming together, and this puzzle forms a suspicion. Sandra did not take her own life. She was the victim of a murder. And behind the crime, it is not just the reputation of a single man that is at stake, but that of an entire institution. At the end of 2020, everything seems to be going well in Sandra's life. No one could have guessed that she would be dead just a few months later. Sandra is 23 years old and finally has her life together. But she has had anything but an easy life. Her father died before she was born. She grows up with her mother and grandmother. But when Sandra reaches her teens, they both die in quick succession. Sandra is left to fend for herself at an early age and grows up with a new family. After all the blows fate has dealt her, stability is what Sandra needs most. That's exactly why Sandra, as a 12-year-old girl, signed up for a youth program. It is run by the local police and is called the Stoughton Police Explorers Academy. This is a program run by the Stoughton Police Department to introduce young people to police work. The children and teenagers who sign up are supervised in their activities by real trained police officers from Stoughton. The police explorers become an important part of their lives. When she has problems at school, things are getting on top of her at home, or she is simply bored, she goes to the academy meetings. Over the years, a close community naturally develops, not only among the participating children, but also between the graduates and the adult supervisors. Most of them are police officers themselves and guide the children through the program. One of the supervisors, Matthew, also helps Sandra with her homework from time to time. At least that's what Sandra, now 15, tells her friends. In reality, however, something completely different is going on. Matthew, who is 27 years old and married, does not meet with the girl, who is 12 years younger, just to do homework. Instead, he ruthlessly exploits the trust the teenager has in him. Sandra and Matthew have sex. Although there is no evidence that Matthew initially pressured Sandra into it, this is a relationship between a 27-year-old married man who works as a police officer and a 15-year-old schoolgirl who also comes from a difficult background. It should be clear to all of us that in this constellation, one cannot really speak of consent. On top of that, Matthew has abuse fantasies that he acts out with Sandra. He makes Sandra play a defenseless victim that he can attack. It all starts in April 2013, when Sandra is 15, as mentioned above. However, Matthew has known her for a year and a half, and since September 2011, the two have been meeting regularly, i.e., since Sandra was 14. The relationship between the two continues throughout Sandra's entire school career. Matthew also meets the teenager outside of academy hours, sometimes even when he is actually on duty as a police officer. The relationship continues for years. Matthew's wife is unaware of this at home. The couple have 2 children together, and Matthew and his wife are expecting their 3rd baby in February 2021. Sandra is now 23 years old, and her relationship with Matthew, which can hardly be called that, has been going on for 8 years. When Sandra finds out about Matthew's wife's 3rd pregnancy through mutual acquaintances, she considers sending Matthew's wife a message. After all, she has no idea that her husband has been cheating on her for years, with a woman who was temporarily underage. Sandra even types a message to Matthew's wife, but moves it to her drafts folder. She never sends the message. The thing is, Sandra is in a bind, in more ways than one. Because in October 2020, she gave Matthew an ultimatum. Either he would tell his wife about the affair or she would stop using contraception from now on. Yes, you heard right. Sandra deliberately doesn't want to use contraception when she is intimate with Matthew because she wants to have his baby. Sandra and Matthew even plan their meetings around Sandra's ovulation to increase the chances of her getting pregnant. All this while Matthew's wife is at home pregnant and unaware of the affair. At the end of December 2020, Sandra realizes that her plan has worked, and she is indeed pregnant. Sandra informs Matthew directly by sending him a message with a picture she drew herself. The colorful sign reads, "You're going to be a father." However, Matthew is not as happy as she had hoped. Even during a clarifying conversation before New Year's Eve, the mood does not improve. Sandra confides in a friend. Matthew apparently said he wanted nothing to do with Sandra and his baby, and that the best thing that could happen would be for Sandra to die. That is exactly what happens a good month later. And much, much more. On January 20th, 2021, an anonymous tipster calls the Stoughton Police. The person says they are friends with Sandra Birchmore, and that she told them about her relationship with police officer Matthew, which dates back to Sandra's teenage years. The police officer who took the call wrote everything down. However, he did not report it to his superior. He did not inform his boss that his colleague Matthew Farwell, as a supervisor at the academy, had a relationship with a 15-year-old girl. Instead, the police officer went directly to Matthew. Matthew became angry and instructed his colleague never to mention the matter again. Matthew is therefore absolutely clear that he acted wrongly when, as a 27-year-old supervisor, he took advantage of 15-year-old Sandra. And he is now desperately trying to cover up this offense and prevent it from coming to light. He also confronts Sandra about the incident. However, she had no idea that her friend had called Matthew's work. After this, it seems to Sandra that Matthew is finally getting his act together. On January 24th, 2021, she sends a message to a friend.
Things are going well, albeit unexpectedly. It threw me off track a bit and made me feel a little uncomfortable. But that's just because of how things have been going so far. He asked me if I would give him a key to my apartment and said that if I didn't tell anyone, he would keep in touch and visit and all that. So that's how it is. Then he looked in my closet and then in the bathroom. But I don't know why. I haven't figured that out yet.
Perhaps Sandra believes that Matthew has been looking at her closet and bathroom to assist with planning for the baby. In any case, this topic is currently occupying all of Sandra's attention. Understandably, she's been eagerly anticipating the child, regardless of the circumstances. As a result, she's very busy in the last few days of January. She buys baby clothes, makes doctor's appointments, and plans how she will tell her friends and family about the pregnancy. She's also thinking about baby names, but doesn't want to decide alone. She texts Matthew to ask for his input. He replies that he would rather discuss it in person. On the evening of February 1st, around 9 p.m., Matthew asks Sandra if he can stop by for a moment. He arrives at her apartment at around 9:15 p.m. and stays for just under half an hour. Sandra Birchmore will never leave her apartment again. Less than 24 hours later, on February 2nd, 2021, Matthew's wife gives birth to the couple's third baby. While the Farwell family welcomes their new child and spends the first few days at home with the newborn, things are very different for Sandra's friends. They have to clear out Sandra's apartment. To their surprise, they find numerous baby clothes. Sandra had not yet told her friends and family about the pregnancy. The relatives speak to the police again. The fact that Sandra really took her own life when, despite the early stage of pregnancy, almost everything for the baby was already there, simply does not add up. The police have Sandra Birchmore's body autopsied. The pregnancy is confirmed. Sandra's friends then suggest that Matthew Farwell is the only possible father. This puts her friends on high alert. According to them, Matthew has been violent towards Sandra several times in recent weeks. He is said to have pushed and threatened her when they met. A patrol officer questions him on February 6th. However, this is not done in an official setting, but in the middle of a parking lot. Matthew makes statements that do not match those of Sandra's friends at all. He says that he and Sandra may have slept together 2 or 3 times in 2020. However, given the timing, their unborn baby could not possibly be his. Matthew claims that Sandra had severe mental health problems and had even been forcibly admitted to a psychiatric ward several times. However, this is a gross exaggeration. Sandra was indeed admitted to a psychiatric ward once, but this was in May 2020 after an argument with a family member. She was released the same day. During the informal interview with his police colleague, Matthew therefore insists that he could not possibly be the father. As we know, this is a blatant lie. However, there is a catch. Matthew is not the only one who could be the father of Sandra's baby. The second candidate is his own twin brother. William Farwell also works as a police officer in Stoughton. And just like his brother, he had slept with Sandra on numerous occasions over a long period of time prior to her murder. So now we have not just one, but 2 police officers who are connected to the deceased. And at least one of them had been sleeping with Sandra since she was 15 years old. As all this gradually comes to light, Sandra's relatives become increasingly certain. Sandra definitely did not take her own life. Rather, her loved ones suspect a covered-up murder for which Matthew Farwell may not be solely responsible. In their opinion, his brother William could just as easily be involved. Sandra's friends fight for more than 2 years for a thorough investigation of the case. As you can imagine, this is not so easy. After all, Matthew and William Farwell are themselves members of the local police force. But after 2 years, an arrest is finally made. And with it, more shocking details come to light. Matthew Farwell has been officially charged with the murder of Sandra Birchmore since the summer of 2024. He is alleged to have strangled her and then staged a suicide. The closet where Sandra is said to have hanged herself is the same closet that Matthew had examined closely a few days earlier. At the time, Sandra even wrote in a text message to a friend that she found this strange. Matthew had not been working as a police officer for some time. He had quit 2 months after Sandra's death. 2 other police officers from Stoughton were dismissed shortly afterwards. One of them is William, Matthew's twin brother. The other is Robert Devine. Both also worked as instructors at the academy. And both were dismissed because they were accused of having an inappropriate relationship with Sandra Birchmore. No further details are known. However, given what Matthew did to Sandra during this time, the worst suspicions arise. Sandra's relatives had to fight for more than 2 years to have the case classified as a homicide. It was only through an expert opinion from an independent medical examiner, commissioned by Sandra's friend, that the cause of death was corrected to foul play. And that is why proceedings against the 3 suspects will not begin until 2025, 3 years after Sandra's death. Hopefully, Sandra Birchmore will finally get the justice she was denied during her lifetime. While waiting for Matthew Farwell's trial, anger in Stoughton is still running high. This is no longer limited to Sandra's loved ones, but also extends to other residents. After all, 3 police officers who supervised a youth program are facing terrible allegations. The exact nature of the inappropriate relationships between Sandra and William and Robert will likely be clarified during the trial. The prosecution is probably still gathering evidence and statements from other people who participated in this academy program as teenagers. The fact is that this case not only involves an alleged murder, but also a massive abuse of the trust that young people in particular have in the police. The supposed friend and helper has allegedly become the perpetrator and shamelessly exploited his position of power. That is precisely why it is so important to keep saying that you should always confide in someone, even if it is anything but easy, and even if it means taking on supposedly superior institutions. Mutual trust and listening are essential in situations like this, so that in the worst case, things don't end up like they did for Sandra Birchmore. And that's all for today's video. I'd also be interested to hear what you think about today's case. And do you know of any other similar cases that should be looked into so that they get more attention? Feel free to write your opinions and any other cases in the comments. Otherwise, there's not much else to say. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching this video, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, bye everyone.